Hey there, TouchDesigner developers. Jack DiLaura here with the Interactive and Immersive HQ. In this video, we're going to work on creating some very cool point cloud effects inspired by Cyberpunk 2077. In that game, there is a firewall called the Black Wall, which plays a part in the storyline. And during this section, there is this super cool kind of vintage video game, early 3D computer graphics aesthetic that looks to have been created all with point clouds, and I thought would make a great inspiration for creating some point cloud effects of our own. So we're going to kind of take that and interpret it in our own way and build something that looks somewhat like that Black Wall part of the game. Along the way, we're going to learn a little bit about working with point clouds. We're going to be mainly working with tops, so it's going to be a ton of fun. So stay tuned. We're going to jump right into it. So for those of you who haven't yet played this game, you're not alone. However, I just thought I would bring up an example of the kind of aesthetic that we're looking at, just in case you haven't yet seen anything from that game. This is the Black Wall that I was talking about. It has, again, this kind of low poly, point cloud, like early computer graphics style. We've got some very cool kind of cyberpunk color schemes going on, and it looks like a little bit of chromatic aberration. But kind of crucially to the effect that we're building today, the wall has these kind of undulating, almost noise-like components that kind of push out from it at different periods of time. So while we're not going to make an exact recreation of the effect that is found in the game, we're going to take this as inspiration to kind of build a black wall of our own. Starting with a blank network, let's go ahead and add a grid SOP. We're going to work with a couple of SOPs to create the kind of basis of our geometry, and then we're going to take everything into the world of tops from there and do a bunch of cool stuff. So we're starting off with the grid SOP. This is going to be, again, the foundation for our own kind of black wall that we are building. And we're going to make a couple of modifications here, mainly to the scaling and the number of rows and columns. So for the version that I made, I set my scale here to my size to be 110 by 32. They're kind of arbitrary values because we can kind of position the camera wherever we want, but that is what I had at the beginning, so that's what we're going to use. From there, we are going to increase the number of rows and columns. So I'm just going to click on the viewer active here and turn on wireframe mode by hitting the W key so we can see those increase. And we're going to increase the number of rows here to 265, which is going to kind of defeat the purpose of turning on the wireframe. But what we've done here is create a lot of different rows, and thus we're going to have very tightly packed points. We're doing this via the grid SOP and not with something like the line SOP and maybe copying that, because we are giving ourselves a sort of flexible system to modify the spacing of these points later on. So we've got 265 rows. Let's add to the number of columns. For this one, I set this to a value of 110, which again, that has increased the number of columns. So from there, we are going to use another useful and fun SOP, the copy SOP, to make several copies of this piece of geometry and stagger them slightly in space. The number that I landed on here was 6. And if we take a look in the viewer, right now they're all kind of stacked on top of each other, but we're going to shift those very slightly backwards from this first copy that we have here. So in the translate parameter, in translate Z, I'm going to set that to 0.25 and hit enter. And although it looks like nothing has happened, that's because we're spacing them very small amount. If you zoom in, you can see that now we have our copies are nicely spaced, and that will give us a cool layered effect in our final output. Next up, we're going to use a transform SOP to shift this several grids actually up in the Y direction a little bit. I'm going to use a translate Y value here of 5, which just shifts things up ever so slightly. We could achieve the exact same result by moving the camera in our final output, but I added this here during experimentation, and just for the sake of making things the same, that's what we're going to do as well. So after that, we're going to add a null as our kind of bookend of this SOP section. That is actually it for SOPs in our network. From there, we're going to convert this data into first a chop and then to a top. Now we'll kind of look at why we want this in the top format. The top format is the typical way that you're going to work with point clouds these days. But unfortunately, there's no way to go directly from a SOP to a top. You have to go through an intermediate chop and then take that chop and go to a top. So that is why we are adding these operators to the network. So I'm going to head over to the chop page and grab the SOP2 chop. If you missed what I did there, I just right-clicked on the output for any beginners so that it would bring up the appropriate operators that I can add after that point, which basically has had the effect of automatically filling in this SOP parameter for me. So just a little shortcut there. From there, we're going to add another null, just in case you decide you want to do something in chop land. And then finally, we're going to right-click on the output again, just so you can see me do that. And then head to the top page. We have the chop to top. So we're taking that data, these 3 channels, and we're going to turn it into a top texture. So first of all, we have a couple of options for the way that we're generating this texture, and one of them is the image layout specifically. We can use this fit to square option to give us a nice square texture that combines the different data sets into one single image. So we're going to have the ability to access the basically the XYZ coordinate for every pixel via the RGB value of that pixel. So that is basically how all of this positioning that we're going to be doing within the point cloud works. For every pixel within this square, we have an RGB value, and those are specifying the position of that particular point within the point cloud. Now, right now, we are only actually pulling in a single channel, which is the first one up top, which is actually the TX channel. And so we are not really getting the full picture of what all of this data looks like. If we set the data format here to RGB, we now have a color image, which is taking into account all of the channels that were coming from our chop. And thus, if we were to click on the viewer here, viewer active, right click on the background and hit view as points, we can see that if we zoom in very closely, we can see all of the points that we had originally created back here in our SOPs. So this is one nice thing about the top viewer these days, is that you can view the data as points. We're working with this abstract data. The texture that we're looking at, it's not corresponding to something that we're thinking of in terms of a visual aesthetic. It is just pure data that we're using to define positions. And so it's really great that we can preview via the viewer here what it actually looks like in 3D, which is where we're going to take this at the end. So that is very useful. If you want to flip back to the regular texture, you can always hit view as image. And a lot of times when you're working with point clouds, people will use this normalized split mode, which again, I've just right clicked on this active viewer, and that shows you the red, green, and blue channels independently. So we can kind of see the values for each one of those channels separately. So anyways, my little aside there about the chop to top and point clouds is complete, and we can kind of move on. So we have, as we saw in here, our grid, our wall, but if you remember from the both the reference from the game and the intro, we had a kind of noisy effect applied to these points. And although we could, go back here in SOP land and add like a noise SOP or do something similar with the chops, it's actually very simple to work with tops to modify these point positions within this texture. And also potentially more efficient because the tops are going to be using the GPU instead of the CPU. So we've got our grid. The next thing that we can do here is to add a noise chop, or noise top rather, to the network and use this to, again, modify the positions of the points that we're making there. So for this initial noise top that I have added, I'm going to crank the period here way up so that it is basically looks like a gradient, but this will all kind of have a purpose in a moment. I'm going to set my exponent here to 0.6, which you can see has kind of made a little bit more of a boundary between the darker and lighter colors. And then I'm also going to set my transform settings here. We're going to use a classic ABS time.seconds reference within the translate Z parameter so that we can kind of animate this noise over time. So I'm going to type in ABS time.seconds, and for this one, we're going to multiply that by a value of 0.1 and hit enter, and that should start having the noise animate. So what is next? We need to also think about the resolution that we're working in, because we want this to be exactly the same as our top two, or our chop to top that we have over here. So what we're going to do is make a little reference here in our resolution parameter to the width and height of that chop to. So to do that, I'm going to make this a little bit bigger and then click on the drop down for the resolution so you can just see what I'm typing in. We're going to first reference the operator. So op, open and close, parentheses, single quotes, chop to number 1. Then at the end of that, we're going to grab the width. So dot width will provide us with the current width of that chop to top. I'm going to copy that and paste it into the resolution H parameter. And I'm going to change the end here to read height for that second parameter to grab the height value. Those should read 419 and 419 because this is a square texture underneath, or if we're looking at the actual texture and not the points. We have a square. And again, if you've changed any of the parameters, maybe the scale that we had set up back here in the grid, you may have a little bit of a different resolution. But if you have copied everything exactly as I have done, you should have 419 by 419 for that resolution. Now, another thing that we have to do when working with point clouds is, because this is positional data that we're thinking about, it is necessary for us to work in a higher bit depth for our pixel format. Now, what does this mean? So normally when we are working with tops, we tend to use an 8-bit fixed RGBA pixel format because it is less processor intensive, more efficient, and we don't really need this larger range of values. So what 8-bit fixed is telling us is that we have RGB values that fall between a range of 0 to 1, and we don't have anything outside of that range. We have no negative values, because when we're just displaying colors, we don't really need values outside of that range because, well, they're not really going to be visible to us and they're not really going to be important. So when TouchDesigner is interpreting colors, we have that range of 0 to 1 for our RGB and alpha for visible colors, and then going beyond that gets into more stuff that we use for data. The other thing between an 8-bit and like a 32-bit pixel format is that they have a higher number of color values that they can represent. So like think of the resolution of the colors that they can represent with those channels increases when we up the bit depth. So when we choose this other pixel format, which we're going to choose 32-bit float RGBA, suddenly that enables us to have for example, for maybe our pixel in the upper left corner here, that can have color values, RGB values for those channels that are positive, are negative, go beyond 0 and 1, and can be much, much larger. And what that means, getting to the point of all of this, is that we can represent the positions in space of all these different points, and we won't be clamped to this little 0 to 1 range. So that's a long aside to say we need this to define our position values correctly. So we have completed our first noise top. What are we going to do with it now? So the first thing I want to point out here is that if we were just to take this noise and say add it to the texture coming out of our chop 2, it wouldn't give us the effect that we saw at the beginning where the noise has almost been mapped in a textural or like a visual way to those points. Like we wouldn't, for example, see that the points in the bottom left here would shift forward and the ones in the top right might shift back if it's black. Because the texture that we have here that's defining our point positions is not just a straight view of the front. We have that extra depth and positioning of those multiple different layers. And so it's not, like a one-to-one relationship. So what this means is that we can take this, we need to basically take this noise and use the information from this chop 2 to kind of map that noise in a way that makes sense to actually do what we are intending to do, which is, take the noise and have it push and pull the points in a way that makes sense visually. So we're going to use this and connect it, that is the chop 2, to the second input here, which is the noise coordinate map, which you may or may not have ever used before. It allows us to take that texture and use it to kind of remap the noise that we're generating. So although this doesn't mean much at this point, we need to do this remapping in order for the noise to actually generate the kind of visual effect and the movement of our points within our point cloud that we are looking for. From here, we're going to add some additional noise tops to the network, which are all going to serve the purpose of generating the type of movement that we want for these points. So if we take a look at the kind of final outcome for a moment here, we don't want to generate a type of noise or movement for these different points in our point cloud in which all of the points are moving all of the time. We kind of have specific sections at different points in time which are moving, and then at certain points in time you'll kind of see that the movement fades out and the points, as we just have seen now, kind of return back to their original state before they start moving again. So we're going to use a combination of multiple noise tops and some compositing to generate this kind of effect, and that is what we'll jump into right now. So the way that I'm going to start is we're going to use this noise top as the sort of template for our additional ones we're going to add. So I'm going to copy and paste that one first. We are actually going to use it connected in that same sort of way to remap the texture, and then we're going to make some changes here. So let's head to the noise page of this second one. And what we'll do is move our seed value to something random. I will choose a Perlin 3D noise for this one. And then we're going to make a couple of changes down here to the kind of range settings that we have. So first of all, I'm going to turn the harmonics down to 0. And then I'm going to set my amplitude down here to a value of 2. After that, I'm going to go to the transform page. I'm going to delete this abs time.seconds reference. So we're not going to kind of move our noise in the Z direction, which creates this kind of undulating noise. Instead, we're going to translate it via the X parameter, which almost looks as though we're panning across the noise over time. Now, of course, because we are remapping this noise with our chop 2 texture, the translation is not going to look, again, as you would expect, but underneath it all, it is going to move things the way that we want. So Here in the translate x parameter, I'm going to type in ABS time dot seconds times 0.01. That's looking pretty good. And then on the output page, I'm going to set the alpha here to noise so that we can generate some transparency in this texture as well. We're going to then copy and paste that noise and place it over to the right. I'm going to then connect the output of the first noise to the second input of this second noise. So we're doing some kind of fancy processing here where we're using this one to remap the second one. Again, just to create a more interesting visual in the end. This one is going to need a couple of changes as well. We're going to start off by moving the seed to something else, any value you like there. And then I'm going to set the period here to 1.5. We're going to leave the amplitude at a value of 2. And one thing I forgot to check here is, we need to make sure that our exponent for this noise and for the previous one are set to 1. So that is going to be slightly important to make sure that those turn out as we expect. So double check that you set the exponent value there to 1. Cool. So from there, I think we are all set with that one. Another thing we can do here too, just to kind of change this texture up a little bit from the previous one, is to change our ABS time.seconds reference a little bit. I'm going to shift this to multiplying by a value of 0.1 for this third noise right here. Once you have all of that fun stuff complete, we can take this one and connect it to a limit. So what we're about to do right now, if we're thinking in terms of our final effect, we're going to take this noise, which is generating all kinds of great position values for us, and we are going to essentially take that texture and remove part of the output. So what does that mean? We're going to take a limit top, specifically, which we've just added, and clamp the range of the values that are coming out of it so that they never fall below 0. And this is going to be a part of what allows us to create this kind of effect where certain portions of this noise that's being applied to our point cloud positions kind of fall back to 0 and cause no movement to be applied to those particular points. So what we're going to do here is to turn on the limit type minimum to clamp, and then set the minimum value here to 0. From there, we're going to composite this with our other noise texture up top. So I'm just going to start by connecting that one and then the limit to this composite. We want this particular composite here to be set to the multiply mode, which it is by default. And then we're going to do the very same thing that we just did a moment ago and add another limit top here after we have done this compositing to, again, clamp our minimum values to 0 and ensure that they don't go in the negative direction. So I'm going to turn that to clamp. I'm going to turn my minimum value here to 0. And with that, we are all set with our texture. So this is a lot of, kind of working blind here, but don't worry, we are just about to dive in to seeing what the handiwork that we've just done has accomplished. The first thing that we need to do, though, is think about how we're going to take this data and apply it to our positions. So in the, again, we're going to reference our final outcome. So in this final outcome here, we really are only moving the points on a single axis. We're kind of shifting them forward away from their original resting position and then giving them a kind of noisy texture and then having it sort of fall back into that grid. So what that means is we don't actually want to apply this noise that we're generating, at least when it comes to the position values, to all of the axes that are available. We only want to specify a single axis to apply this movement to. So when we're thinking in terms of top textures, that means that we have to apply it to a single color channel. And if we go back here to the kind of beginning where we are taking this chop data and converting it into top data, we can think of it this way. We have our TX up top, that corresponds to our red channel. Then we have our TY, which corresponds to our green channel. And finally, we have our TZ position values, which is our blue channel. So for our particular effect, we actually want to specifically move our points in the Z direction only. And so what that means for us is that we need to basically take this noise texture and only apply it on the blue channel. So I'm going to use a reorder top rather to accomplish this. I'm going to add that after the limit. I'm going to connect the limit to the first input here. And then I'm going to turn off the output on the red and green channels. I'm just going to set that to 0 for both of those. And then we'll leave the output blue channel to output the blue from the input. And finally, we'll add a math top after that to enable ourselves to kind of increase the range of these values a little bit. So I'm going to head to the mult add page here, and I'm going to multiply this by a value of 2. That is going to have the effect of basically shifting the positions of the points in our point cloud more in space. So we can control that via this math. So, okay, we've been working blind. Let's take a look at what this looks like. So we are going to need to take this data and combine it with our chop2 data, and then we can actually use it to render some points. So we're going to do that with a simple composite, and I'll place that over here to the right. The composite we're going to set to the average mode, although you can experiment with others, see what kind of results you end up with, but I'm going to do that for our example here. So my operation here is going to be average. And there we go. We have our final texture for the positions of each one of these points. So we're going to take a little shortcut here to save time. We actually have a very handy operator or a pre-built comp over here in the palette. Again, you can open up the palette by hitting Control B or Command B if you're on the Mac. Head to the point cloud folder, and then we have a very handy point render comp, which I'll drag into the network. So this basically gives us a whole rendering pipeline and materials and everything all ready to go, and expects for the input a top texture, which is going to define the point positions. So what I'm going to do here is drag this output of our composite into the first input of our point render. And what we should see then is that we have some points, and they are also moving a little bit at some points, and then kind of going back to their initial position afterwards. So this is actually functioning, but we have a camera position that is extremely close to our grid. So we can hit the home camera or the frame camera option here, and we have black. The reason that this has happened is because we have a material that is the line material, which is applying color to these instances, or these points rather, via the distance that they are from the camera. So we need to make some changes in our point render very briefly before we can actually see the outcome. So I'm going to head inside here, and we'll take a look at our line material. So the line material is right here. And again, that is going to add color to our points based on how far they are from the camera, as well as doing some other things like scaling and some fun stuff like that. First of all, we need to head to the setup page, which I'm going to set first the distance near setting to 5.5. And then we'll leave the distance far alone. We'll leave the width near alone. See if we've got anything else we actually need to do within this one. I think that's actually it for us. That has shifted the near position further away and allowed for our points to reappear. So if we head back up a level, we should see now our entire grid with the noise applied appearing in the output. Now, we don't have any color applied yet, and we're going to add some post effects, but we have the kind of basis of our geometry all functional, and you can kind of move the camera position around to find something suitable. I did a kind of view of it from an angle to give a similar sort of aesthetic to the black wall from the video game, but feel free to kind of position that however you want. So there we go. We have our point cloud, we have our noise being applied to it, and let's talk about adding some color now. So for the color of our points here, it's actually going to be super simple for us to set up. All we need to do is use something called a lookup top and a ramp to give us a range of values, color values that is, that can be then applied to our points. So I'm going to add the ramp first and place it down here in the bottom. This one we don't really have to do that much to, but we're just going to kind of add in some colors to taste. I was, again, kind of trying to replicate the particular style of the game, and so I picked some specific colors. The first one is kind of like a, not quite a periwinkle, something in that range, though. So I'm going to set my hue and my saturation and value and kind of shift that around a little bit. Then in the middle of the ramp, I set somewhere in between a very bright red and a pink. So I don't know, maybe more in the red direction. And then for the white keyframe all the way on the right, I changed that from white to a kind of lighter pink color. And I shifted this more in the general kind of center of the pink section of our ramp. So that is my kind of gradient that I'm going to use to color the points. And we can also turn our pixel format up here if we want to kind of increase the number of colors that we can represent. Not necessary, but you can if you'd like to. And then I'm going to add the lookup top right now, which is going to allow us to add the color. So I'm going to take this texture, which is kind of our final pre-reordering and kind of taking it back into positions land. We're going to use this one prior to that modification in this first input of our lookup. That is going to be our source image, and then we're going to use the ramp as our lookup image. So that has effectively used this ramp to apply colors to the image coming out of this limit based on our index channel setting. So I've left everything at the default with mine, but you can definitely play around with some of these modes if you want to see how the color can also be applied. From there, the second input here allows us to specify a top that will apply color to our points. So I can just simply connect this lookup directly to that second input, and there we go. We now have color being applied to the points in our point cloud. Before we move on to post effects, I just have to make a couple of quick corrections. We actually did not change some settings correctly earlier, and thus our point positioning looks a little bit different than what we saw in the intro. So first of all, let's head back to the noise 2 operator. This one here, we set to a value of 50 for the period. And actually what I meant to do was have us set the period value here to 500, which is many times different than what we initially put in, and thus if we go back and take a look at our output already, we should have something that looks different. Mainly what that is going to change is that we're going to have much larger areas where the noise will not be applied, and it won't kind of make it look as though we are applying the noisy texture to all of the points or most of the points within our point cloud. Secondly, we have another parameter in the next noise top that we forgot to change. The offset here was set to 0.5 and actually should be set to 0, which kind of brings that whole value range down pretty significantly. If we go back to the output, again, this should have impacted how much noise is actually being applied. We should have sections where we have little to no noise, and then have the noise start kind of coming in slowly and undulating in a much more dramatic way than we would have had otherwise. So without that, you'll kind of see much more consistent noise almost all of the time. And with that change, now we have much more of a transition between states. Again, as usual with these kinds of things, I would highly recommend tweaking any of the parameters that you are interested in experimenting with to see how they impact the results. Because as you can see, even just from those two simple numbers, we have a very dramatically different result in our noise pattern that we've added to the position. Without further ado, let's dive into our post effects section. I'm going to start this off by right-clicking on the output here and adding a null as a kind of bookend to our positioning and adding color and all that fun stuff. The first effect that I'm going to work on is a form of chromatic aberration, which is something that we've looked at in previous videos here on the HQ. It is an effect that comes from lenses. You might see it on old CRT monitors, in which the layers of your image, the different color layers, are slightly separated. So this will look different depending on the type of lens that you're using or the screen that you're viewing it on, but it gives this kind of shifting of where, say, the red layer and the blue layer are slightly offset, and it gives it this kind of vintage and cool sort of look to our output. It is something that you will see quite a lot in the Cyberpunk game, and so we're going to work on recreating it. So first off, we're going to add channel mix top. So this one is kind of, you can use this, at least for this example, interchangeably with the reorder top, in that we're just going to use this to kind of turn on and off different color channels. So I'm going to connect this to the null. And for this first one, we're going to basically isolate the red channel as the only channel that we're outputting. So I'm going to turn the green channel to 0 and the blue channel here to 0. And then we should be left with a red version of that image. From there, we're going to copy and paste this operator. For the second one here, I'm going to turn the red channel to 0 and then go down to the blue channel here. And in this third box, I'm going to type in 1 to turn that blue channel back up to its kind of initial value. To get the very slight shifting of those channels, we're going to use transform tops for each one. I'm going to copy and paste the first one and apply it to my second texture there. In the first one for the red channel, I'm going to shift the X position by 0.01 and then the Y position by 0.02. Now that is 0.2. That's a little too dramatic. We want more subtle shifts than that. Now what we'll notice though is that we end up with a very hard edge at the bottom because we don't have any additional texture here. We are basically shifting the texture from the bottom edge up, and we have the ability within the transform top to kind of deal with this in a more visually appealing way. If we head to the tile page, we can turn this extend mode to something like mirror, and it will instead mirror the texture along that boundary. You can play around with the other modes. I just thought that this looked better than having a kind of hard line that follows the edge of the screen. Now we're going to do exactly the same thing over in our second transform. This one is going to move things in the opposite direction. We're going to shift negative 0.01 in the X and then do the same in the Y, negative 0.01. Just like the previous example, I'm going to turn my extend mode to mirror so that we don't have as hard of an edge at the top of the screen. After that, we're going to composite these two together and I believe use the operation of add here to add those two color layers. So I'm going to connect those to the input and change the operation to add. Then we're going to use a ramp, and we're going to use the ramp here to basically tone down the amount of chromatic aberration at the center of the screen a little bit, and then leave it at its kind of full setting on the edges of the picture. This, again, is inspired by the game. If you look at the game, there will be certain sections in Cyberpunk where the chromatic aberration gets a little bit more extreme, but it's always kind of on the periphery that it is at its most extreme, which gives this really nice kind of depth feeling to it. So we're going to basically work to accomplish something similar. So I'm going to add the ramp, and I'm going to connect the ramp, the output of transform number 3 to the input of the ramp. Now, what that is doing right now is basically compositing the ramp along with this texture, but all we want to do in this case is just grab the resolution from this operator instead of compositing it. So I'm going to head to the output page and change this combine with input setting to set resolution only. From there, we'll head back to the ramp page where I am going to set my keyframe over here on the left to a white color to start, and then I'm also going to set the alpha here to a slightly reduced value of 0.3 approximately. After that, we want, instead of a horizontal type for our ramp, we want to do circular so that we have this kind of dip in the center of our screen. Then I'm going to set my period here to 0.85, which kind of brings that circle shape in a little bit. For the extend mode, I don't want this hard edge when we reach the end of our ramp. I want to instead use the extend left mode of mirror. You could also do something like hold, which I think we'll try in this case. So set that extend left to hold, and that will give you a nice white boundary around the edge. I'll turn my interpolate notches here to ease in, ease out, which gives us a little bit smoother of a transition. And then if I take these two textures and add in another composite, we can use this to basically cut out or reduce the opacity in the center of our image. So cool, that looks pretty good. We may have to tweak that a little bit depending on how the final output looks, but overall, the idea here is that we want to use this to, again, kind of cut down on the opacity in the center so that we have this applied more on the edges. Now we're going to composite this texture with our original output from our render, and I'm going to use yet another composite for that. I'll place that over here. I'm going to drag the null into that first, and then I will connect the second composite, or actually composite number 4. And then we want to set an operation here. I chose maximum, which does a pretty good job of combining those two things. You can see we've got some pretty strong chromatic aberration at the edge, but in the center, it looks a little bit less so. Again, we can probably tweak this ramp if we want to either increase or reduce the amount of chromatic aberration that's happening at the center, but I think this does a pretty good job of achieving what we're looking for. Next on our list is to add a nice blur around the edges in a very similar way that we've done with our chromatic aberration effect, using, again, a ramp and a Luma blur. So first of all, let's add another ramp to the mix. I think we can just actually copy and paste this previous one because our settings are going to be somewhat similar. And I will connect the comp 5 to the input of the ramp to set that resolution once again. Then I'm going to make a couple of changes here. We've got, first of all, we want to change this left color keyframe back to our original color of black. I'm going to turn the alpha back up and the value back to 0. Here I'm going to set the period to 1.43. And with that, we are good with this particular operator. Let's go ahead and add the Luma blur, which is going to take this texture and use it to apply blur to different parts of the image. So first of all, I'm going to connect comp 5 to the first input and then the ramp to the second input. And then I'm going to change the white filter width here to a value of 8. And if we preview that in our background here, we can see we now have, along with the chromatic aberration being applied on the kind of outskirts or the edges of the image rather, we also have a nice blur being applied there as well. Again, feel free to kind of tune this to your personal taste as we continue on. Now, another huge part of the cyberpunk aesthetic is the kind of bloom effect that is applied, especially in the darker scenes, to things like the lighting, the neon signs that you see throughout. And we're going to use a nice built-in bloom effect in the palette under image filters. Right at the top, we have bloom. We're going to tweak this. It's not going to be perfect, but will give us something in the ballpark of that effect. I just kind of played around with this until I found something that looked decent. And first thing we're going to do here is connect the Luma blur to the first input of the bloom. I started off with my threshold parameter here, which I set to 0.22. Then I increased the intensity to a value of 1. I reduced the contrast to 0.34. And then down on the bloom level parameter, I set that to 0.55. So you can see here, we're kind of brightening things up a little bit, reducing the contrast, allowing the kind of highlights of the image to pop and turn almost to a whiter color than they were previously. For the glow level, I turned this down to a value of 0.275. And then I also went ahead and I changed the glow color to white instead of this blue color, which again kind of shifts the tone of the image a little bit. I turned the ramp glow level to 0. And from there, that was actually it for this operator. So that is our bloom effect, which you can see definitely has kind of made our image pop a little bit more. We're going to kind of follow that up with the same sort of idea by adding a level top afterwards, which is going to be used for just a simple bump in contrast. So I'm going to use the contrast parameter here and set that to 1.6. For our very final step, we're going to add a constant to apply a background. So within the constant, I will set my color to black, and then I will go to the output page here and use the operation option of under, which has successfully composited that black background underneath. Finally, we're going to hook up a null, and that is it for our effect. So we can take a look at our handiwork in the background. Here is the point where you can start adjusting things. I actually think that my contrast has even bumped up a little bit too high now. So I think I would even maybe reduce that down and tweak some of the other parameters to kind of continue experimenting with this look. So with that, we have completed everything within the scope of this tutorial. I hope this gives you an idea and some inspiration for working with using the operators built into Touch to build your own point clouds. First of all, we don't always have to import them from external sources, but also to work with tops when you're dealing with point clouds to apply effects to the point positions. There's actually a lot that can be done here, although you have to think a little bit differently because obviously we're not paying attention as much to the aesthetic of the texture so much as the impact on the final positioning of those points. But there's a lot that can be done with even kind of everyday tools like the noise top. Finally, hopefully this section here where we delved into post-processing in a little more detail has given you some ideas for how you can kind of take not necessarily a bad outcome from your render, but how you can kind of spice that up a little bit with some different tools and hopefully use those tools to make a cool either cyberpunk themed or whatever type of aesthetic you're looking to go for composition of your own. So with that, we're going to close out the video. Hope you have enjoyed putting this together. Thanks so much for watching. Looking forward to seeing you in the next video.
Hey guys, thanks for watching. If you're serious about taking your TouchDesigner and interactive skills to the next level, I highly recommend you check out the Interactive and Immersive HQ Pro. It's the only educational resource and community of its kind for TouchDesigner and interactive professionals. You can learn more by checking out the link in the description. And if you like this video, don't forget to hit that like button. And if you're new here, don't forget to hit subscribe and the little bell icon for more awesome free content.